So when the 1840s, or at least after the age of the Jacksonian democracy period, which was discussed earlier, the next big thing that really comes into the major forefront here is the period of the 1840s and into the 50s. And as we know, sitting here in the 21st century, we know that the Civil War is only about 20 years off in the making. But the United States as a country is beginning to the sectionalism and the major problems that were emerging in the early 19th century or even in the late 18th century are really becoming more exacerbated here by the 1840s. And the growing sectionalism is creating a problem within political and social life, particularly when we look at the topic of abolitionism. So abolitionism is something that had been, so abolitionism, the desire to free slaves, is something that happens early in the 18th century, right? We have Quakers who are coming to Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania as a state is really one of the first places to get rid of slavery, um, or at least stop the importation of slavery, I guess I should say. This gets new wind with the evangelical movement, and African Americans, former slaves, are involved in the evangelical Christian churches. However, there's also, um, growing, I guess, for people within the United States, right? There's a growing fear of, if we do liberate these slaves, what's going to be the situation in the United States? So there's a growing movement to try and repatriate or move former slaves back to Africa. Now, you can imagine that this is extremely ridiculous, right? Because most of this, all of the slaves who are here in the United States in the 1830s had not come from Africa. I mean, there might have been a very small percentage, less than 10%, had ever lived in Africa. But now here we are in the 1830s or 1840s, and there's this desire to move people back to Africa, and it's just kind of ridiculous. Um, so this American Colonization Society winds up moving some people um, I shouldn't say back, moving people to Africa. They established the colony of Liberia. Again, even though that some of these people may have lived in Africa at some point, very few are indeed coming from Liberia, what is today Liberia, on the west coast of Africa. So, again, this is one of the first attempts at this. Now, William Lloyd Garrison, who's a very famous um, abolitionist. He's the author or the editor of a newspaper called The Liberator. And he is one of the people who advocates for anti-slavery movements really early on, as early as, again, the 18 teens, but then his papers formed in 1831. And the movement is really becoming, obviously, powerful, right? In the North, there's a Christian component to it, for those people who um, viewed this as a major sort of Christian issue, right? That slavery was something that was a sin against God. Um, so, for those of you who even know Frederick Douglass, right? Frederick Douglass is very active in northern New York, in the city of Rochester, with the Little Women of Rochester. And again, they're a church-based organization. So all of these different there's a Christian connection here. And again, there's these different movements going on. The problem here is politically. Within the United States, I hope you remember that the southern states are obviously the slaveholding states, and after the Missouri Compromise of 1820, there had grown to two sides, right? 12 slave states, 12 northern free states, and that balance had been struck for again another 30 or so years. But there's this growing political problem where, for the Southerners, and again, who are the people who have the political power here? The people who owned the slaves tended to be wealthiest in the South, so they had the political power. So that helps to encourage the idea that slavery needed to stay, and it was becoming a really big political issue. So we know about the Missouri Compromise. The Eastern Seaboard, obviously the original first 13 colonies turned states, were extremely populated. And as we move westward, there's more and more territory opening up and more territory coming under the United States control. And that's particularly true after the 1803 Louisiana Purchase. And that's, again, particularly true, again, as we move westward and westward. However, there's also this sort of, again, where will slavery end? How far will slavery go? The Missouri Compromise basically strikes that, right, with the 3630 parallel line. No slavery above that, except for Missouri. However, all of these things are creating major issues. There's also a major flux of immigration in the 1840s, pushing people westward. So that if those of you who know your sort of global or at least European history, right, you'll remember that Ireland has a major potato famine in the 1840s that pushes a lot of Irish immigrants here to the United States. Germany goes through a lot of sort of political distress in the 1840s as well, so there's a lot of German immigrants. So there's two cities that are growing. There are many cities growing, and particularly as you head westward, you have major cities growing, right? So you have New York and Philadelphia, Richmond, you have sort of the Virginia colonies, Southern colonies, Charleston having major city populations. But then by the 1830s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, that major population is spreading westward, right? So you have Chicago, you have Cleveland, you have those Ohio cities, you have Nashville growing, you have these major, or New Orleans, you have these major more western cities growing with larger populations. Now, as I say, northern cities are really the ones growing, and I pointed out three of them: Chicago, Cleveland, and I guess Nashville's southern, but Nashville is still at least industrially important. So you have a growing sectional problem still, right, where these northern cities, urban industrial cities, growing industrial cities, don't need slave labor, and they're becoming more economically prominent. However, um, the South still is growing slavery as slavery heads westward into Texas and the newer states after the Mexican-American War in the late 1840s. So you have these growing sectional problems, growing urbanization, but here's the other problem. What is the first major industrial industries are textile industries. Well, in the United States, where is that textile fabric coming from? Well, it's cotton grown in the South. So when the cotton's grown in the South, who's doing the major piece of the labor? Well, slavery, right? So northern industrialization is on the backs of the slaves of the South, right? So there's this great irony that's going on here. And we talked about that a little bit last week. Irish immigration is really a big part of this, right? So one of the big pieces here is that there's massive discrimination against Irish people. There's a lot of fear against them, right? They're predominantly Catholic because most of them are coming from Southern Ireland, which is still in the 21st century, still a very much Catholic country. However, for a lot of the people, they are very poor, and they're not only poor, but they're Catholic. So there's a lot of discrimination against them. There's a lot of fear of them, but a lot of them are coming into the cities, and they're staying in eastern cities, right? So New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and they are because they are so poor, they can't head west. Now they're also undercutting jobs, right? So in the cities, they're taking jobs away from people who might otherwise be able to have these jobs. There's growing tensions between African Americans, former slaves, and Irish folk as they are both competing for the low paying jobs. It's really becoming a really interesting situation in these cities. So I want to jump here to the growing mechanization um, and the growing concern over the different populations of the United States. Growing mechanization, we know. I hope you, if you've taken other courses, is the Industrial Revolution starting in the late 18th century begins increased mechanization of products, and as I said before, you have growing industrial output in things like textiles, right? So you have the cotton gin invented by Eli Whitney in the 18th century. You have increased factories. All of these things are creating more economic output, but also greater opportunities for people, right? So one of the other pieces to this is that there's greater ability for people to start working in factories, but it also increases the need for slave labor because you also need more cotton. So obviously you need more people to pluck that cotton. There's also another piece to this, right? So for people who are moving into these cities, there's also growing opportunity for jobs. There's also growing fear of these immigrants. So one of the things that happens here is you also have the growth of education. So there's the growth of the common school movement, and your textbook talks about that. So there's growing common schools, right? So one of the first things that happens here is some cities, some towns start to encourage universal education, education up to a certain point, usually about 10 or 12 years old. But it encourages a couple of things. You can read the Bible. You can read certain patriotic texts. So we start to create the common school. Again, why we call it the common school, because everybody gets the common education. And it's these are ways for students and for us to sort of encourage certain types of morals. And again, that comes out of this fear of immigrants, but also this demand that there's increased education within the industrial community. So this anti-foreigner movement is a very nativist perspective, right? America for the Americans. And there's fear over Catholics, there's fear over Germans, there's fear over Irish, but the people who are coming here are typically Irish Catholics or German Catholics. So again, that fear is important. So the 1840s has a lot of different situations going on, right? You have growing abolitionism in the North, sort of recalcitrant, more entrenched slave holding positions for the South. Those are in competition. You have growing urbanization, but growing urbanization means that you have growing fear over native populations and immigrant populations. You have growing common school concerns. You have all of these different conflicting ideologies going on in the 1830s, 40s, 50s. And they're triggered by domestic issues, slave versus northern, or yes, slave versus free states, South versus North. But there's also growing fears over foreigners. All of these things are growing in the 1800s. And again, sitting in the 21st century, we know what's not that far off in the distance, the growing Civil War and the problems that will happen as a result of that. So all of these issues are sort of straining the United States in the 1840s and creating major problems that are going to blow up a decade later.